Obsidian Entertainment and Bethesda game studios have been linked together in the past, from Fallout 3 to New Vegas to the similarities in their RPG systems, and even today with the Outer Worlds and now the recently released Starfield. Today I wanted to put these two sci-fi space RPGs into the boxing ring to see who comes out on top. As with all of these video game verses, we're going to compare 5 critical elements of these games. For each of the categories, I'll pick a winner and we'll see who wins at the end. This is all obviously for entertainment value, so let me know your favorite down in the comments below. Let's start with the technical category that I like to call technical because I don't have a better name for it, but that's graphics, performance, and bugs. And we'll start with the Outer Worlds. So a while ago, the Outer Worlds did get like an enhanced edition patch, which made more issues than it fixed. But before then, even at launch on PC specifically, there wasn't a whole lot of performance issues. Like there was some minor FPS issues in some of like the open areas, but in a lot of the towns and everything, performance was pretty good. And that's partly because in the Outer Worlds, a lot of areas and environments are very small and condensed. And that's not to say they're not interesting or anything like that, but it's just there's a similar to a Starfield in a way, how there's a lot of loading screens before you get into areas, but in the Outer Worlds, they are much smaller. So if you're going into a town, you have to pass like a loading screen, or you're going outside that town, you have to pass that loading screen, and that definitely helps with those performance issues. And graphically, I really love the color palette in the Outer Worlds. There's that really like oversaturated feel with definitely a wide color palette depending on the planet that you're on. Whether you're starting on that first planet, there's lots of greens, and then you sort of go to Monarch with a lot of oranges. But overall, that sort of consistency across the board is that sort of oversaturated palette. And I really like this style. Like there's a really strong design and style to all of these planets and structures, and that sort of cartoony, I don't know what I would say, like that specific style. It's not cartoony, but it's also not realistic. It's got a really nice design across the board that's very consistent, and I really like that. And also at launch, it was pretty bug free too. Like there wasn't really any bugs that I can remember, and even today when I've been playing a fair amount of the game, both in an old save and creating a brand new character, I haven't come across anything, which is really good for RPGs. Like RPGs in general often have a lot of bugs at launch, and you know, I know that Bethesda definitely have a stigma for that, but it's across the board, right? Like I don't know why Bethesda are the ones that get slack for that. It's just when you've got games that have so much choice and consequence and freedom, you're definitely going to have issues, and the Outer Worlds was really bug-free at launch, which was quite exciting. Starfield, on the other hand, performance-wise, is good, not great. Now, there is obviously a ton of shortcomings, right? Like, we can talk about the DLSS issues, we can talk about the lack of overall, like, settings when you're in the actual just menu in terms of things you can change, FOV slider, all that stuff. But across the board, though, like, it's pretty good, right? It's not great, and I'm not saying it's like, you know, perfect, but it's pretty good. Like, I don't think I've ever dropped below 30 frames, and, you know, I even said in my review that I think it's actually not bad, and like just in general how great the game looks. You know, considering that, it's actually not bad. Like, I just love landing on planets and exploring and seeing like the vistas when you look out on these like different planets. And I think in a way, like that's the sort of consideration you have to think about when you think about the performance here. Is there's a lot happening in Starfield, and there's all these big open environments. And so, you know, generally speaking, there is going to be some sort of performance issues, but it mostly happens in like those big cities, which is similar to, you know, the Outer Worlds in that range as well. Bug-wise, there's definitely been a few in Starfield. I mentioned in my review, I had that one like quest breaking bug, but that was fixed in like the day one patch. Otherwise, every single quest and every like major thing that I've tried to do has worked, and I've had no real actual issues, just like visual things, you know, like NPCs floating or like glitching out, that sort of a thing. Like nothing really serious, and that's honestly like passable for me. Like I haven't really had anything that's like dampened my experience at all. Just like a couple of funny things here and there, which is like fun, you know. I kind of like running into like weird little graphical glitches like that. So in terms of this category, I think the Outer Worlds takes this category for a couple of reasons. One, the performance here is silky smooth, and obviously, you know, there's Starfield will probably get to that point eventually. The bugs as well, like there was definitely a limited amount of bugs in the Outer Worlds. Obviously, there's still a good design with that in Starfield. Graphically, though, I really love the design of the Outer Worlds. Like I love that oversaturated look, and I love the sort of direction that they've taken with the art, and Starfield has plenty of that. That's absolutely incredible as well, don't get me wrong, but the Outer Worlds consistency across its entire game, and it being a smaller game, it definitely helps with that, but I think it wins in this category, and especially the lack of settings in Starfield definitely does dampen that experience. Moving on to story, and we'll start with the Outer Worlds. So as a lost colonist, you are essentially woken into a deep conspiracy that's threatening to destroy the Halcyon colony colony by the mega corporations. Now, the general theme of the Outer Worlds is like capitalism and, the real world risks of mega corporations, like Apple and Amazon, and that general sort of hierarchy structure of, the rich and the poor and the workers versus, the leaders. There's a lot of consistency in capitalism and the sort of structure compared to things that we deal with today. And I think that even despite that, there is just an abundance of choice and consequence in the Outer Worlds. There is so much of it, and it's always has an interestingness to it with the different characters that you run into and their own sort of likes and dislikes and how they feel about the world, and then the choices you make like impacting them or not impacting them. There's a lot of really interesting outcomes in the Outer Worlds, and your choices actually matter and make tangible differences, not only to the ending when you get that sort of ending montage. I love those ending montages in games, but just like generally across the board, you make tangible impacts to the world around you. And that's not even talking about, say, companions, right? Like, well, maybe say like massive side stories, like say a factions quest line from a Starfield is missing in the Outer Worlds. I really like the tight structure of the main story, plus having those sort of companion storylines that you can expand on with, like Pavati, I remember having an incredible storyline. But there are 6 companions here compared to the technically 4 for Starfield, which we'll get into in a little bit, but they are very different in the Outer Worlds, right? They all have very unique interests and backgrounds and where they sort of came from and the way they think about the world, and doing their quest lines, not only to just like romance them, right? But like actually helping that character develop and learn from, say, their past or find something new in the world was really unique as a way to take that in terms of the depth of the character. Whereas in other games, and using Starfield as an example here, you do their stories and they are definitely interesting, but you're sort of going for that outcome of like, say, romancing them or maxing out their friendship. Whereas in the Outer Worlds, for me personally, I actually wanted to learn about the development of those characters because they were so engaging. And especially even in the main story, like there's incredible writing in the Outer Worlds that just cannot be understated as how funny different like lines are and just how engaging this is. And it is such an important part of a RPG like this, where you are constantly talking to people. Having really good voice acting and writing is like a massive pillar that you have to stand on for a game like the Outer Worlds to actually work, and they absolutely pull it off here. And all of that rings true for Starfield. I found it interesting returning to the Outer Worlds, and I noticed how similar the dialogue presentations are in both of these games. You've got that character that takes sort of center view with a bit of depth of field in between, so it sort of blurs the background. You've got the unvoiced character arc with the dialogue sort of in the middle there, and I just thought that was an interesting thing to note, that a lot of these dialogues are presented exactly the same in both of these games. Just an interesting thing. But this is new to BGS games, right? Like Fallout 4 may be the exception here, but it's very common in the Fallout 3, etc. But so in Starfield, as a sort of mining recruit, you pick up an artifact based on a contract, you see some visions, and then you are quickly whisked away into this mystery and involved in constellation and finding out what is out there in the galaxy. Both of these games have very similar setups and very typical RPG setups, right? You're just like a random person, you choose your stats, whatever, and then you do a various thing that is like the catalyst to essentially kick off a massive adventure that you just put yourself in the middle of everyone's problems and you go out and fix them. Now, while I absolutely love the main story in Starfield, and I think it's absolutely one of the best that Bethesda have ever written, there is some significant pacing issues in Starfield, and that comes from the freedom of what you can do in this game, right? So the Outer Worlds doesn't suffer from this issue because it's a much more condensed and tight experience where, there's not an entire galaxy to explore. It's just one system, and even in those systems, they're very small areas. Whereas in Starfield, you've got literally the entire galaxy. And what I mean by those pacing issues is you can be at a very pivotal moment in a faction storyline or the main story and get completely sidetracked doing something totally like menial or completely off the beaten path and just something completely random, and then you go back and you just within a moment you're just like whisked into this massive epic battle deal, whatever. Occasionally they can be at odds with each other because of how easy it is to be in a completely different system and do something completely different, and it looks completely different because of the overall like freedom of how these different areas in Starfield look, that sometimes it feels like you're playing a different game compared to whether you're in the Aquila City Western fantasy, right? Or you go to Neon and you're in a cyberpunk world. There's just a lot of difference there. And while that is absolutely one of Starfield's strengths, sometimes that pacing of the sort of general story arc struggles because you can go off and do so much. And I think that that's just part of the game, right? Like, that's one of those things. And I want to touch on companions here as well. Like, I did mention that there is only the 4 in Starfield. And while there's plenty of, crew members and what have you, there is only that core 4. And you sort of have to strike a weird balance here with these 4 because they're all kind of the same, but they're kind of different. So they are all obviously a member of Constellation. They do all have, their different wants and backgrounds and etc. But they feel like too similar because they're all a part of Constellation, and there's definitely no evil character, right? Like, all of the companions are just like good guys, and they're somewhere on that scale of like being the, the absolute do-gooder or being like sort of like a grey do-gooder like Andrea. And I think that's a major criticism of Starfield. It's just that lack of like a companion that fits like an evil character playthrough. Like, if you're playing as an evil character, you just can't have the Constellation companions, right? And that's all 4 core companions that all have like backstories and interject into the main story and side stories, have interesting dialogues. You just like can't have them because you'll do something and you'll piss them off, and then they'll just leave you and hate you forever. And that's kind of sad. And I think that, the game should consider those options. Like, you could have, the adoring fan, crew members, whatever, but having a core cast main character that does that, I think, is something that's significantly missing in Starfield. The last thing I'll say here is that the faction storylines in Starfield are absolutely incredible. Every single one of them is entirely different and unique and just has a really interesting like story to it and characters. And something that is always in Bethesda games is the faction storylines are often better than the main story here, but I think the main story in Starfield is incredible in its own right, but then these factions are just so different because of the freedom of having like the entire galaxy. You can make these factions be completely different. You have to deal with the political issues of the United Colonies, or say, jumping into Ryujin and trying to climb that corporate ladder and do some corporate espionage. They're so different, and I really like that about Starfield. So who takes the cake here in story? This is a really close category because there's a lot to love in both of these and some things to dislike. But, I kind of think it is the Outer Worlds. And part of that is because of the overall, like, consistency and throughput through that game, right? Right from the start, there is a very clear, not like a linear path, because you do have that freedom of choice and consequence, but you're sort of following the same general structure from start to finish. Whereas in Starfield, you can get lost in all of this stuff, and some of it is really, really good, and some of it is sort of okay, and some of it's like not so good. Whereas in the Outer Worlds, from the companions to the main story and just the general side stories and stuff that you find in the world, I think is all at a really high bar consistently across the board. So I think it goes to the Outer Worlds. All right, combat. Returning to combat at the Outer Worlds, I remember it being better than it was when playing it. Like, as I was playing and I tried some melee weapons, I tried some ranged weapons, and it hasn't aged very well. It feels very Fallout New Vegas, like that old school, or not even New Vegas necessarily, but like that old school RPG first person sort of shootery gunplay, which is fine, right? Like that gameplay loop is still like good enough to, be there and be solid. And you've got that time slow mechanic that's sort of like VATS. It's sort of, I like the time slow. It is a good mechanic, but there's a few shortcomings here, right? There is a limited amount of guns that you can play with and variety across the board. But, the main aspect or unique aspect here is the elemental types and using the right element, say like using a shock weapon on a robot, right? Like, you've got those elemental weapons and sort of the rock, paper, scissors of that, using it on the right types. But overall though, the combat here is very easy. Like, even on the hardest difficulty, you sort of, and this is an issue with a lot of RPGs, because of your overall abilities and skills, etc., you outpace the combat and you just become like this god super easy. And like, there is the supernova difficulty in the Outer Worlds, but also the supernova difficulty has its own shortcomings, which I'll touch on a bit in the world design section, because I actually made this video about 3 years ago, and it's a very well written video that you should go and watch, and it's about why I don't like the supernova mode. Ignore the terrible editing and audio from a young Norza still finding his place on the internet, but that's actually a really good video that talks about why the supernova mode isn't actually that good in the Outer Worlds. Starfield, however, has really good combat. Like, it's actually a solid first-person shooter, regardless of whether you talk about, like, you know, the RPG mechanics and everything on top of that. There is such a variety in all of the different ranged weapons, and the further you get into the game, that just sort of opens up to you as you find, like, say, particle beams or, you know, EM weapons and these different types of weapons that do different things. Enemy AI is pretty good. Like, there's some shortcomings there, but they do try and flank you. They do move around, take cover, do all that stuff. There's some interesting interactions where, like, you'll kill someone and, like, other people will react, and even just reacting to your overall hits is really good in Starfield. Like, I love shooting the boost packs and they explode. Like, all that stuff is really solid. The combat in Starfield absolutely just wins here by a mile. Like, I don't think I need to say much more. You can just, if you go and play these two games side by side, you can just notice how much better Starfield's combat is, and that's not even talking about the boost pack and the verticality of how the gravity impacts. It's funny when I've been playing like hundreds of hours of Starfield over the last like 2 weeks, and then I go and play Outer Worlds, and literally the first thing I try to do on every planet is boost pack, and I don't have a boost pack, and like just the gravity being the same as well. Like, I was like, it just felt so sad. But you know, they're completely different games, right? But Starfield absolutely wins this category. I don't need to say more. World design, we'll start with Starfield here just to mix things up. So in Starfield, you have the just extremely large and diverse amount of landscapes that exploration here is just on another level, right? Because the fact that you can land on literally any planet, and obviously, you know, some people don't like that, and there is planets that are going to have nothing on them, and then planets that are going to have stuff on them, right? That absolutely is a thing, because that's just how planets work. But every planet just has this amazing vista where you're like looking out, you can like see the sun and like other planets, or even just mountains and things in the distance, or the aliens and creatures on the planets. Really just love exploring in Starfield. Now, when you're like finding new locations and stuff, they are a little bit samey, which makes sense because of the procedural generation here. But the interesting thing here is that you don't have to engage in that if you don't want to, right? Like, if you don't like exploring on random planets and just finding that sort of like samey procedurally generated content, you can go and do something else. You don't have to engage in that, and giving you that option I really like. And I also love the random encounters, which has always been a massive plus in Bethesda game, is those random encounters. There's plenty of really brilliant ones in space. Like, I remember running into a guy that was just like singing in his spaceship, and even other things. Like, there's just so much detail in those, and it's fun running into random people that just like tell you something funny or tell you something interesting. And there's even a little bit of that on the planets where you come across people that may need some help, you know, settlements need your help, that sort of stuff. But the big ticket item here is the major cities. Now, there is plenty of cities in Starfield, but there's the three main ones being Neon, Aquila City, and New Atlantis. Fun fact here, returning to the Outer Worlds, it's very interesting how similar these three main cities are in Starfield to the Outer Worlds' three main cities, right? You've got Neon, that cyberpunk themed city, which is very reminiscent of the Groundbreaker, like the neon lights and everything. And then you've got, say, Aquila City, that sort of Western theme, which is very similar to Edgewater, that first town you get in the Outer Worlds. And then you've got New Atlantis, which is your like big, you know, like pretty, like built up main city that with like the big towering buildings, which is very reminiscent of Byzantium in the Outer Worlds. How, I don't know, like, it's clearly not on purpose, but I just think that's very interesting that both of these sci-fi space games have very similar like main locations, but they're different in their own way. But I just thought I'd point that out because I thought that was interesting. But in terms of the Outer Worlds, other than that, the difference here specifically is that every single space is much smaller than Starfield, and those areas are denser in terms of their exploration and their handcrafted content because they are smaller spaces. So you've got like less area to explore and really sort of find yourself in the world, but those areas are often a bit more interesting, and you know you're going to find something that has been handmade by people, whereas in Starfield sometimes those areas are a little bit grey because you don't know exactly where you are. But then, you know, if you're in the major cities, you obviously know that they're handcrafted stuff there, but sometimes that line, and when you're on either side of those lines, can be hard to determine. The one thing about the Outer Worlds that is a massive negative is this is the full thing that I talked about in that Supernova video, so go and watch it. But like the dynamic open world, right? There is no real random encounters or dynamicness to the world, right? So this may have changed since launch for sure, but you know, at launch, right, there's no real random encounters. You're never going to run across someone that's just going to, you know, tell you something funny, or, you know, just have some interesting interactions with you that's different on each playthrough, right? Like, a lot of the enemies and quests and everything are always in the exact same spot across the whole game. So you'll always run into, say, marauders at this exact location on every playthrough, or you'll run into, you know, this exact quest here at this time on every single playthrough, right? Like there's never any of those sort of random, like emergent spots in that game. It's very static across its game world, which is, you know, fine. It's just that it lacks that replayability-ness of having those random encounters and that emergent style of gameplay that comes out of those random encounters. So here, Starfield wins this category, right? So overall, Starfield has tons of exploration that you can choose to engage in, or you can choose not to. You can survey systems, or you can choose not to. You can choose to explore these places or not, right? And in the Outer Worlds, you've got that choice a little bit as well, but you're sort of being pushed through the world. Like the game is always pushing you through these planets and locations, through these smaller spaces. You don't have that freedom to just completely go off the beaten path and ignore things. So I think that I prefer Starfield's design in that way. So to recap here, we are now 4 categories down. We've got the Outer Worlds on 2 and Starfield on 2. Our last category is progression. This is my favorite category that I like to talk about. So the Outer Worlds has many progression systems, and it's always about leveling up here. And as you level up in the Outer Worlds, you'll pick skills and perks for your companions as you want to expand them as well. The Outer Worlds has a lot of options for freedom of how you want to develop your character. This is a minor thing, but in the Outer Worlds, you pick your attributes and skills and aptitude before you actually pick your appearance, just like based on that like typical system. And I prefer it the other way that Starfield does, where you pick your appearance and then your background and traits. It's a minor thing, but I like to pick who I am before deciding what I am. It's a minor nitpick that popped into my head when I was making my new character in the Outer Worlds, but while in the Outer Worlds you are leveling up and finding new weapons and armor and picking skills and perks and all of that good stuff, something that is a core problem with role-playing games and is absolutely present in the Outer Worlds is that after a certain point, you basically just become a god and your stats become sort of trivial. And as long as you've invested in, say, all the hacking skills or all the persuasion skills or that sort of, lockpicking skills, and you can do essentially anything you like in the world, you just become this god that just can do anything. And I prefer a style where you pick something, say, I'm building towards ranged weapons, right? I have to use pistols because that's what I've invested in and I can't use other weapons. And so in that way, I'm a bit restricted and it adds that replayability. Whereas, this came up a little bit earlier as well, is that it does lack a little bit of that because you can sort of just become good at everything. Like even when you're leveling up, say, if you use pistols and you're leveling up your ranged weapons, you do actually get progression into like your long guns and stuff as well. So in that way, you can easily switch to an assault rifle and still have really good success. And that's evident in the different skills of like persuading and everything like that as well. Now, before we move on to Starfield, I just want to point out that how aptitude is very similar to backgrounds in Starfield. I just found that quite like an interesting little tidbit. So the Starfield background and traits is the main decisions you'll make during character creation after you've picked your appearance. Backgrounds give you a head start into like specific skills, very similar to like how you pick skills during the character creation of the Outer World. And then your traits being one of the best features in Starfield, and that I absolutely hope more developers do this, as well as Bethesda in their future games. So traits being that you get a positive and a negative effect, and they can absolutely help with that replayability and changing up different playstyles, like whether you took kid stuff or took Adoring Fan or took Wanted or what have you. Your game will have significant differences to other people as well as other playthroughs. The skill system in Starfield being a mix between Fallout 4 and Skyrim, I really like. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of complaints with about is how long it takes to level up. And I'm probably in the minority here, but I low-key like that. I really like that it takes a long time to level up because it makes you invest more into your build, because you're going to make that right decision about what character I'm trying to build. What am I trying to be? Am I going into the social tree? Am I going into the tech tree? Am I going into combat? What am I focusing on? What is my build? What is my character? And it prevents you from becoming that, just like we're talking about the Outer Worlds, you just become so overpowered so quickly that by like level 25 or so in the Outer Worlds, you're just like a god and you just steamroll everything or can do everything in the world. Whereas in Starfield, you have to make those tangible choices. Eventually you'll get there, right? Like eventually you'll just become that god anyway. But I like how long that takes and that you feel like every skill point actually matters. Whereas there's a point in the Outer Worlds where you're just sort of like, oh, I got some more skills. Yeah, we'll just like bump them in here, put that perk here, whatever, and sort of move on. Whereas every skill that I had in Starfield, I was making that decision. It was like, all right, I want to invest in boost pack more. I need to make sure I'm using it in combat so I can get the higher ranks, or if I'm trying to get the better piloting skills so I can pilot the better ships and then use that. Something I've got to touch on, and it just ticked into my mind, I can't believe I forgot this in world structure, is space travel, right? There is no space travel in the Outer Worlds. How did I forget this? It's even in my notes. Anyway, so yes, there's no space travel in the Outer Worlds. You basically go through the cutscene and then just leave your ship. And Starfield is sort of a weird hybrid between, say, that design where there's literally no and the complete freedom of No Man's Sky. And I like what Starfield has sort of done into at least have that as an option and have stuff there, but we're getting sidetracked. Back to progression. So I think here that the progression system in Starfield is definitely better because it does take that little bit longer. You pay attention to your build a little bit more and deciding exactly what you want to be and do and how that does impact dialogue and choices and consequence. And that is present in the Outer Worlds as well, but you can become a jack of all trades very quickly in the Outer Worlds, whereas in Starfield, it definitely takes you a bit longer before you get to that point. Companions do have skills in Starfield, but you can't really change them literally at all compared to the Outer Worlds where you can change their perks, but just wanted to call out the differences there. So Starfield wins this category. Starfield and the Outer Worlds are definitely different games, and we've been talking about this for 25 minutes now. They are different in their own way, but there is a lot of similarities between these space RPGs and how they choose to tackle their worlds, their dialogue, their story, their progression, all of that stuff. And I think it's a fun exercise to put these games together, and they are both absolutely incredible games. The Outer Worlds is one of my favorite games of 2019. Starfield is one of my favorite games of 2023. Both of these games are great, and this is just a fun exercise to compare two massive RPGs of this style. But I would love to know your thoughts on this video game versus format in the comments down below as we continue to do more of these, and I enjoy doing these, so I'm really interested to see what you guys think, and if there's things that we should change or do differently, please sound off in the comments below and let me know your winner as well. Thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.